Back to the screen. Okay. So we covered our code word, and now we'll talk about what are some of the approaches that I've proposed to replace the DSM, or just in general, the categorical belief. So in general, these more empirical approaches tend to be more dimensional. And the reason that they're dimensional is A, not only because we view psychopathology and all behavior along a continuum, but also because of that idea of comorbidity. When you have alphabet soup of all these different labels, and you're wondering, how do I treat it? Is there anything in common? That question of, is there anything in common between this multiple list of disorders can be answered by a transdiagnostic system. So it's transdiagnostic because it cuts across multiple different disorders. And it's wondering, is there something common to all of them that we can treat? Instead of working on depression first, and then anxiety, and then PTSD, and then this, right? Because there's certain approaches or treatments that have been developed to one of those things. But how much time do you have? That could be really expensive. Is that really getting at the core issue that might be at least related for at least three of those disorders? Perhaps not. And so some of these approaches lend themselves better to more transdiagnostic, dimensional approach that can be more helpful and a little bit less costly for the person or the practice. Again, it's not a top-down approach, it's a bottom-up. So it's bottom because it starts from the research, from the evidence, and it goes upwards in terms of there are certain statistical techniques to, instead of be able to say, my belief is that after I see the data and it goes upwards, I see these clusters of people, instead of me saying, I think that looks like this. There are statistical approaches like factor analysis that'll say, oh, okay, these specific symptoms cluster together. These specific symptoms cluster together. It doesn't correlate at all with this, or it does, but not as strongly. So there are certain statistical approaches for categorizing them, or at least having more of a hierarchical approach so that you can still look at the symptom level, but also be able to look at clusters. So statistical approach might be better than my own judgment, right? And because we have that issue of low diagnostic reliability, statistical modeling at least helps us look at the empirical work. So one of the first approaches that was proposed that I don't think people consider a dimensional approach, but when we look at it, we definitely think it's dimensional, is the Achenbach system. So for kids, when you're giving any assessment to a kid, one of the most common types of assessment tools will be the CBCL, so a child behavior checklist. So that's the parent report. There's also the teacher report form. So these different forms are all under the Achenbach system, and it's intended to tap into all psychopathology, but instead of asking the parent, do you have this? Yes or no? Do you have this? Yes or no? All the questions are dimensional and that you can say not true at all up to very true. So there's technically there's only three response criteria, but it's dimensional because it gives you a severity style of questions that you can answer. It's a little bit more hierarchical than the DSM because it goes symptoms and then it clusters into two broadband syndromes. So it says there are internalizing symptoms and there's externalizing, and you can go upward and say, okay, this kind of, if we're going to keep the categorical language, this looks like depressive disorders, this looks like anxiety, this looks like attention deficit. So it retains both of them, and it's one of the oldest systems. So, and it continues to be used, which is really helpful. The thing about this SEBA system is that there's a man named Achenbach, and this is the person that developed all of this. So number one, there's like a paywall, so you have to pay for all of these things. And number two, part of why it's, for purchase is because a lot of that time, effort, resources that they had to develop the system was to be able to create norms. So you would have your person take this particular assessment, and then you get all the answers, and then it considers development because if you look at the system, you scroll all the way back to the back and you look at the T-scores and you recognize, okay, so in general, based on the normative population that have taken this sample, this particular test, I have my child and they actually fall way outside of the normal distribution. So we're using the normative sample and the normal distribution to be able to place your particular tester, your particular individual, to see whether or not they're comparing to what peers their own age would look like. And the other thing about this system is that it's also, not only is it normed by age, but also by gender or by sex. So there's norms for males who are 7, norms for females who are 7, and so on. I said there were different versions, but they all are considered Achenbach. So what I just mentioned is the child behavior checklist. So there's different ages. I'm really familiar with this last one right here, the 4 to 18. Those are all parents who fill it out. And then you can also use a teacher report form. So you give that to the teacher. And you can also get the child to self-report. So that's a youth self-report form, and that's for kids between 11 to 18. So that's one system that I'm really familiar with in the research that I personally didn't like tap in as like oh, that's a dimensional system until reading your guys' text and like putting it together and thinking about the model. Okay, so that's the ACEBA system. We also have HiTOP. So HiTOP is a more recent thing. And the people who are behind HiTOP, just like you have all these steering committees who make proposals to the DSM, those are the same type of people who were part of the HiTOP committee. So HiTOP stands for the Hierarchical Taxonomy of Psychopathology. That is a group of dimensional people. There are people who are very strong in statistical methods. And so a lot of HiTOP was developed, again, evidence-based, but using a lot of statistical modeling. So the way that people in HiTOP conceptualize psychopathology is, of course, that things are dimensional. But rather than saying, again, there's mood disorders, there's this disorder, like the Achenbach system, they're looking at domains of internalizing spectrum, externalizing spectrum, and they use factor analysis and all types of those other statistical methods to figure out, are there other spectra that explain that general idea of all these different categories. So they have a bunch of different spectrum, and then it's hierarchical because it goes down and also goes up into this higher pyramid looking thing. It's hard to explain, so here's what the image looks like. One thing to note here is you'll notice down here at the symptom disorder level, this blue line, it retains all of the categorical labels. That's just to help users understand what HiTOP is. It's not that they actually put like MDD in their model, because that would be counterintuitive. So the way that they look at this is it's hierarchical because it has rank order. So at the very bottom, at the symptom level, you have someone who endorses their signs and symptoms. We also care about traits. So there's certain surveys that you can give that really tap into like personality traits. So it goes up a little bit, and then you put them into syndromes. So these are things that might resemble your categorical labels, but notice how there's like multiple of them. So all of these, social phobia, agoraphobia, all of these are things that have been researched as previously all anxiety based. So when you went from, I think, DSM-3 to DSM-4, there was some research. And so OCD and all panic all were considered anxiety disorders. With more research, we've recognized that anxiety disorders maybe have their own mechanism, but they're very similar to OCD or panic. And so if we go up, what is that thing that connects those things? It's the fear domain. Fear, distress, mania, eating pathology, sexual problems, they all fall within the internalizing spectrum. Those are all things that happen inside. Versus if we're looking at the externalizing symptoms on the right, we have this spectrum of dissipated, antagonistic. Those two things are different flavors of externalizing, but they're still considered externalizing. So what you might see in substance abuse is what you might see, like some of those symptoms and signs might be really similar to antagonistic externalizing that you might see in some of these externalizing conduct type flavors. So conduct disorder, ODD, which is oppositional defiant disorder, you might see some overlap between those and substance related disorders, because in this model, we view them as both externalizing disorders. So it's helpful to look at what's the higher order dimension, and really, for me, the spectrum level. Like, what is the internalizing? Is it externalizing? Or is it there's this thought disorder? That's really helpful because that's more of a transdiagnostic approach, and it looks at what are all the flavors that have similar things in common, what does not. So one person can have a bunch of things in this internalizing domain, they can have a bunch of things in this externalizing, or they might all be within one certain domain. And that's more helpful because we can tell, at least with treatment, what's more of a transdiagnostic thing that will help with this internalizing stuff versus let me do one treatment for MDD over in distress. Once that's done, let me do another treatment for GAD, which is generalized anxiety disorder. Why do two different treatments when you can do one that taps into both? And same thing with these other externalizing. I didn't do a great job explaining it, so there's also this video. I think it's like 2 minutes if you want to watch what high top is. And that'll do a better job of explaining what the different levels are. So that's high top. RDoC is another approach that's been has been proposed. I wouldn't call this a classification system because the goal is not necessarily to give you labels. Instead, this is a research initiative. So it was proposed by the NIMH, the National Institutes of Mental Health, and they're like a federal committee that funds a lot of research. So a lot of your professors in the Department of Psychology have a lot of grants from the NIMH. And so because it's a research initiative, the goal is not necessarily to immediately be able to label people. Instead, the initiative is to gain a lot more research at multiple levels of analysis to be able to understand, are there any things that get below the skin or are different levels of units of analysis that can help explain mental health? And that's intended to be translational. So if you have different findings at the person level, so we look at the context, but we also look at the physiological level, we look at the gene, all that type of things, that might be helpful for eventually treatment. So NIMH really funds research in this area. And so for them, they have 8 units of analysis instead of systems or symptoms or spectra like high top. Because we consider multiple levels of analysis in RDoC, we look at what is the context, what's inside the person, we look at what interacts with one another. That's really thought to be closely aligned with the developmental psychopathology framework, which we spent a lot of time talking about. So this is an example of an image of what you can think about when we're looking at RDoC. So we have multiple different domains, so negative valence, positive valence, cognitive systems, systems for social processes, and arousal modulatory systems. So each one of those domains is going to have specific areas of interest that fall under negative valence or any one of these domains. Why it's considered multiple levels of analysis, though, is because on the right side, you see all the different levels of analysis that you can research to be able to tie back to this domain. We consider environment and the developmental context because that's what the green circle is. So environment is outside, neurodevelopment is outside. We can think of that as being developmentally considerate or important because we know that those things interact with the individual. And then we can go upwards to physiology, behavior, and self-reports. So all of this is really helpful and really aligned with developmental psychopathology. We look at how the environment interacts with the individual. We look at how the environment or the individual interacts with the environment. And we look at multiple levels of analysis. One of the criticisms of RDoC is that some people think that a concern is that people may look at RDoC and think it's reductionistic in terms of biology. So just because we're doing research on genes and cells doesn't mean that you can tie it back immediately to the person. And that's true, right? We're not trying to be reductionistic. In fact, it's the opposite. We're trying to look at how all these different things that are components of an individual and their environment interact with one another. And we know that that interaction is what drives psychopathology or how the community and different levels of people that people interact with come back to them. So all of it is important. We care about the environment, we care about neural systems, and we can categorize things in terms of these domains. So those domains would be negative valence, positive valence, cognitive, social, and arousal and regulation. If we think of the negative valence system, we can think of what are the neural circuits that drive negative valence? What are the physical behaviors that happen? Is there any physiology going on in an individual? So if you look at potential threat anxiety, I might think of someone that I characterize as having OCD from the categorical system, and I might look at different levels of analysis. I might want to look at physiology, I might want to look at self-report, which still counts, and I might want to look at like neural circuits. I know that in OCD, this might be implicated. One of these might be implicated, so sustained responsiveness to reward. Under the cognitive, cognitive control would be implicated, and then arousal we know would be implicated. So again, if you look at it this way, it's really a way to develop research questions and bring it back to the person and ask questions about psychopathology versus creating a system with different diagnostic labels. But it's still considered an empirical dimensional approach because the end goal is to eventually get back to psychopathology. And instead of giving labels, using this kind of information to tap onto whatever we want to label people, if we're still going to use labels. I didn't do a great job explaining that one either. So here's another video. I think it's like 4 minutes on RDoc. I'm not going to play it. You can play it on your own. I do think RDoc is really important for child psychology, for all those reasons we talked about how it taps into developmental psychopathology. So I think there's going to be a question on this particular topic on the exam. Okay. We might end on this one, but before I get to this, any questions about HiTOP, RDoc, or SEBA? Oops. Mhm. Mhm. Okay, so again, we talked about this example of how would you, like I talked about OCD, let's look at it in pictures. So if we're to look at OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, which is a disorder that falls within categorical approach. So we know that there is a diagnosis of OCD in the DSM. We know that these are the diagnostic criteria in the DSM. So you have to have A, B, C, D, and you can specify one of these insight criteria. So in the DSM approach, you need to have the presence of obsessions, compulsions, or both. If you have questions about what those are, you would look here. What are obsessions? What are compulsions? So an individual who meets criteria for OCD can have obsessions that are defined in this way. They can have compulsions that are defined this way, or they can have both. We also know that they need to be time consuming, which is criterion B. And we know that these symptoms should not be attributable to any other medical condition or the effects of a substance. So we really need to parse apart. Is this interaction with a drug, like a substance, or is this actually happening within the person? Is this actually a mental health concern? And then the other thing, this is common, C and D always shows up for all the different disorders. So it can't be attributable to a physiological substance, can't be attributable to another medical condition, and it shouldn't be attributable to another mental health disorder. If it is, then you should consider that diagnosis. Um, so there's a lot of like really specific things that you have to meet, and yet anything might seem like an obsession to a clinician, and anything, excuse me, might seem like a compulsion. So these are helpful because we know this is what it looks like when we're hearing a person come to us and tell us that they have some concerns about themselves. But we can see that there's there's a lot of room for error. So I might define something as a compulsion that someone defines as something completely different. But this is the diagnostic criteria for OCD. We compare that to HiTOP. Um, Remember, HiTOP is the ones with the different spectrums. So we have thought disorder, internalizing, externalizing, and so on. So in this paper that I highlight here, it just looks at what are the different symptom clusters in OCD that we might want to look at in HiTOP. And so here it says that OCD might fit best under that fear, distress domain. So those two things fall under internalizing symptom, but both of them are different and are still implicated. And it might be implicated in the thought disorder spectra. So that goes a little bit above it. So we have internalizing and thought disorder, which seem to be implicated in OCD. And specifically in the internalizing, we have the fear spectrum and we have the distress spectrum. So that's helpful for research for sure, because we know that there are certain like neural mechanisms that are implicated in the fear response and the stress, like what are the cognitive things that maintain it. And we know with thought disorder, that explains kind of like that bizarre thinking that you might see in sometimes OCD, but also there might be some overlap with some like psychotic disorder spectrum things because of that thought disorder component. So this is really different than the DSM, which gives you specific criteria that you have to meet, whereas HiTOP would instead look at what are the spectrum of disorder, like clusters that seem relevant, and are there any treatments or anything we can do within that particular spectrum. And that gets a little bit more specifically at OCD. How do we treat it, right? If we know what the mechanisms are of fear or distress, we know that there are certain treatments that work for that versus what is this like label that we give them in the DSM approach? And is there any distant intervention that's supposed to be mapped onto that disorder? That's different than, okay, so again, that's internalizing. So that's fear and distress. And then that's this thought disorder thing. That's different from RDoC. This is from an animal paper. So again, this is not necessarily immediately translated to humans, but at least in this paper, they did find that the habit domain of RDoC, looking at that is helpful. So looking at the potential threat, looking at habit, and looking at cognitive control. All those things might be studied in OCD. So if we look at potential threat is here in negative valence. If we look at habit, that falls under positive valence. So what are the things that maintain it? Why is it that there's some reinforcement from the compulsion? And then if we look down here, cognitive control, why is it that the thoughts keep coming back? What is it that maintains it? Can we study the different mechanisms, whether they're genetic, neural, physiological, any of those things? Is there a way to link the cognitive control to the potential threat over here? We know all those things seem to be implicated in OCD. So now we know there's more research that needs to go into figuring out how these things all connect to one another to present itself as OCD. So the negative valence, positive valence, and cognitive systems all seem implicated. And then within that, there are certain things to study, whether it's cognitive control, habit, or potential threat / anxiety. So those are all the systems we're going to cover today. I'm looking at the time. I'm going to stop there because I think the assessment tools are like another section to talk about. Any questions about what we talked about so far? What's happening with the test or the exam, when it happens, things like that?